Lunar New Year break, and I'm going to see if I can record a video on Macbeth for the Great Plays and Philosophy playlist. As was perhaps the case with the Hamlet video previously, this may be more philosophy nerd talks about Shakespeare than it is a systematic explanation of connections between great plays and philosophy. So, Macbeth is a historical tragedy centered in Scotland. The story in the play is based on the records in Holinshed. Now, you may never have heard of Holinshed. Raphael Holinshed is a 1500s writer. He wrote a book called The Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, a history, or something like that. The simple historical facts about Macbeth are in Holinshed's writing. Now, I should mention before going on that there's more than one murderer in the history of Scotland, and the details of the life and murders and eventual death of Macbeth are borrowed not exclusively from Holinshed's account of Macbeth. Personally, some of the details are borrowed from other murderers. Holinshed also includes supernatural elements that we find in this play. There are witches, there are prophecies, there are weird events that are signs that terrible things are happening. Holinshed is also not a particularly reliable historian. Now, I'm not an expert here by any stretch. I can tell you that's the sort of thing that will be said about Holinshed. Google Holinshed, Holinshed. Now, I can certainly say that within the story, this is entirely accurate. I'm just not sure I can guarantee that all the history is accurate. I can tell you there is a historical backstory behind the tragedy of Macbeth. Macbeth was an actual king of Scotland and a bad guy. And some of the details are in Holinshed with some other details, and Shakespeare takes some artistic liberties writing a magnificent story based on the details in Holinshed. All right. Maybe just one more note on the historical context of the supernatural elements in the play. King James of England wrote a scholarly work on demons called the Daemonology, D-A-E-M-O-N-ology. This book, the Daemonology of King James, was written during Shakespeare's lifetime and was pretty popular in that era. So the implicit, not necessarily always explicit, but the implicit background of the story is the supernatural is real, the Christian worldview is correct. The Christian worldview is correct, which means, among other things, there is such a thing as supernatural evil in this universe. Satan exists. His minions exist. These witches are on the side of Satan, the three witches in Macbeth. All right. Now, maybe I should make one very brief observation on Macbeth and philosophy before getting into the text. Actually, we have to do more than just get into the text before we can get into the text. More observations about philosophy before we can get into the text. Let's do one quick one. In the story of Macbeth, you never really see him do anything good, at least not from the moment when he starts going bad. Macbeth is just a bad guy, at least when he starts going bad. And until the end, he's just a super, super bad guy. But in the historical record, we have some indication that Macbeth did do some good laws. He made some good laws. He spent some time as king, not just being a mass murderer. So that's interesting. And what interests me about that is there's this line where Aristotle suggests that fiction is more true than history, meaning not that it has more facts, but that it goes directly at universal truths, like tyrants are bad guys and they come to bad ends, that sort of thing. The Macbeth play is more true than history in this sense. It demonstrates that a tyrant is a really bad guy and comes to a really bad end. That's the story of Macbeth. It's a story about corruption and murder and injustice with some semblance, some amount, some imperfect quantity of justice in place at the end. And it captures some of these moral principles, right? But the historical event wasn't necessarily, the historical events were not necessarily like that, because the historical character Macbeth was not pure evil. Macbeth in the play is pure evil, at least once he starts going down this murderous path, once he starts going bad until the end. There is little to nothing good in him. It's a much more straightforward case of bad guy than the historical character Macbeth necessarily was, probably was. So that illustrates the Aristotelian point that in terms of getting at the moral truths, fiction is sometimes more accurate, more reliable than history. All right, so enough of that. Let's go to this other Aristotle issue. What sort of tragedy is this? Macbeth is a massive, massive jerk. Is this a tragedy, then, in Aristotle's sense? Now, in Aristotle's sense, a tragic hero is supposed to be just that. He's a tragic hero. Macbeth is no hero. He's supposed to be better than we are. Macbeth is not better than you and I. You and me. He's not better. No, you and I. He's not better than you and I are. Grammatical point. We're not ending the sentence at you and me. He's not better than you and me, as if that was just the end. No, this is shorthand for the completed clause. He is not better than you and I are. So we have to say you and I, not you and me. Anyway, it's implicit that the rest of the sentence is there. So Macbeth is not better than you and I. But can he be considered better than we are? In one sense or at one time? Yes, actually he could. In a sense, he is better than us in that he is more noble. Not necessarily more morally noble, but just literally noble. He is a Scottish lord. We are not, assuming you're not a Scottish lord. I don't know for certain who's going to watch this video. But most of us are not royalty, right? We're not lords. In the beginning of the play, in addition to being a higher station in life than we are, because he's royalty. In addition to that, he is a great guy at the beginning. He's a war hero. He just saved Scotland from the bad guys. Yay, Macbeth! He's got amazing strength, amazing courage. And he also has a very strong sense of morality. He says, I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none. Meaning that he is not afraid to do anything that is right for a man to do. And he thinks a man who does not do what is right is not really a man. And then he goes bad. He goes very, very bad with lots of murders. So if he's a tragic hero in Aristotle's sense, we should be able to say that he is better than we are in some sense. And those are two senses in which we might say he's better than we are. He starts off very morally good. And also he is higher than we are in that he's a Scottish noble and we are not anything of the sort. But if he's a tragic hero in Aristotle's sense, we also ought to be able to identify his tragic flaw. And we should be able to feel pity for him. But can we feel pity for him? Well, this is the sort of thing people write articles in scholarly journals about. This is the sort of thing people can write books about. Let me suggest one interpretation of Macbeth, according to which Macbeth is a tragic hero in Aristotle's sense. But you have to focus on the beginning of the play a little more than usual. His tragic flaw would be, I think, his susceptibility to his wife's advice. His wife helps him to go bad. Lady Macbeth, Mrs. Macbeth, his wife encourages him to begin his path along the way to seizing the throne and lots of murders. She's like, I'm speaking in something more resembling contemporary English, she's like, don't be a wuss. You can achieve this greatness. Follow through on our plan to kill the king and take over Scotland. And he listens to his wife's advice. And his tragic flaw would be listening to his wife's unethical advice here. So we can pity him, not when he is a mass murderer and then he's defeated and killed much later in the story. No, we're supposed to pity him at the beginning when he becomes a murderer. We're supposed to pity this person of morally noble character who's also a nobility, a member of the nobility. We're supposed to pity this person of morally noble character who makes the mistake of listening to bad moral advice from his wife and becomes a murderer. We're supposed to pity him then. I think also, though, we could say that this is indeed a tragic story, but it doesn't quite fit Aristotle's account of tragic plays. Maybe Aristotle's account is not fully correct or doesn't cover everything. I think we would be foolish at any rate to say that this is not a tragic play. This is a tragic play. This is Macbeth. This is Shakespeare's Macbeth. This is a paradigmatic tragic play. If it doesn't fit Aristotle, then Aristotle doesn't cover all aspects or all varieties of tragic play. But I have suggested one interpretation I think is reasonable, according to which it does fit Aristotle. You just have to focus a little more in the beginning of the play to find the tragic flaw and have some pity for him then and not as much at the end. But I'm not sure I'm committed myself to that interpretation. I don't think it's unreasonable to say this just doesn't quite fit the Aristotelian sense of a tragic play. Anyway, what happens in this play? Here are some major characters. There's Macbeth, who is the Thane of Glamis, and then later the King of Scotland. Thane is a kind of Scottish lord. There's Lady Macbeth, his wife. There is King Duncan. There's Duncan's son Malcolm. There's Macbeth, another one of the Scottish lords. There's Banquo, another Scottish nobility. And then there's the three witches, or the Weird Sisters, they're called. Those are some major characters, and what happens in the play. Let's look at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and then look at some philosophical perspectives on some of these issues, and call it a day. This won't be half as long as the Hamlet video, I think. In the beginning of the play, please read the play, or find a good production of the play to watch. This summary I'm about to give you is not a tenth, not 100th, not 1,000th as good as the words of the play. The play itself is magnificent. I strongly recommend reading Macbeth and or watching a good production of it. Incidentally, in terms of film production, I'm not exactly a scholar of these things. There's probably a lot of good Macbeth productions I haven't seen on stage. In fact, I don't know off the top of my head that I can remember seeing any Macbeth on stage. There are probably some magnificent film productions I have not seen either. I haven't seen the Patrick Stewart one, unfortunately. And alas, a very new one I have not seen, though it looks magnificent in the trailers, is Denzel Washington. That looks superb in the trailers. I'm going off what a friend told me and what it looks like on the trailers. I strongly recommend the Denzel Washington Macbeth. But also, if you can get this, I strongly recommend the Orson Welles Macbeth, much older, also black and white. The Orson Welles Macbeth, I think, is a very fine film version of Macbeth. Anyway, I recommend watching one or more versions of it one way or another, and reading them. But now, to a quick summary that doesn't substitute for the details, for the beauty of the story, for the magnificent language. Macbeth and Banquo at the beginning have just helped King Duncan defeat the enemy armies. Returning from battle, they meet the three witches. The witches greet Macbeth as Thane of Glamis and Thane of Cawdor and future king. Now, the Thane of Cawdor is a different character who is a traitor in this war. As it happens, King Duncan has just ordered that the Thane of Cawdor gets killed, executed for his treachery, and his title be transferred to war hero Macbeth. So Macbeth is now legally the Thane of Cawdor, as well as the Thane of Glamis, but he doesn't know that he's Thane of Cawdor yet. Macbeth hears from the witches that he's Thane of Cawdor, and that he's Thane of Glamis, and is going to be king. And he also hears that he's not going to have any kids who are king after him, but Banquo will not be king, and Banquo will have descendants who get to be kings. You shall get kings, i.e. beget kings, i.e. you shall be the ancestor of kings, though you be none, say the witches to Banquo. So Macbeth will be king, Banquo will not, but Banquo's kids will be kings, and not Macbeth. So something of a mixed bag for both of them. And Macbeth soon learns that he now is indeed Thane of Cawdor, and he starts thinking about becoming king, since the witches were right on 2 out of 3 so far. And the king and his sons now are going to be staying at Macbeth's place tonight. So Lady Macbeth, having read a letter from Macbeth about this, plans their murder. And she urges Macbeth to go through with it. Now let's not skip over everything. There is a, I don't know how to say it, a powerful scene where Lady Macbeth embraces evil. And she says, she speaks to, what does she call it, murdering ministers? Basically, I think she's speaking to demons. I think in the story, we're supposed to assume it's quite literal. She speaks to evil supernatural beings and tells them to help her be evil and go through with this. The language is very powerful. I don't want to botch it by trying to just recall it. In fact, I don't even want to botch it by reading it. I couldn't pull off a Lady Macbeth properly. Read it for yourself. Find a good film production of Lady Macbeth's evil soliloquy. All right. So anyway, Macbeth, after some hesitation, takes his wife's bad advice, and they do it. They murder the king. Lady Macbeth helps put the blood on the servants so that they get blamed. When the murder is found out, Macbeth kills the servants. He pretends to be enraged. Malcolm and his brother flee Macbeth becomes king. Malcolm does have a brother. Malcolm, son of Duncan, has a brother. One of them flees to Ireland. Malcolm's brother flees to Ireland. Malcolm flees to England. Macbeth becomes king. He's the nearest relative of the king, and he's a recent war hero. He's Thane of Cawdor and Glamis. He's the natural choice for king now that Malcolm has left. All right. So there's also a lot of powerful, dramatic illustrations of the moral issues here. Like Macbeth hears a voice. We don't know what's going on. We wonder, did he fall asleep and dream it? I don't think that is an option based on the text. You have to check the text, though. Did he hallucinate it? Did he actually hear a voice? Perhaps the voice of some angel announcing step one of God's justice. The voice says, "Sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep." Macbeth has murdered the king, and now he will not be able to sleep. The difficulty of sleep deprivation is actually a fairly important point of the play, and it's not normal people having trouble sleeping. It's straight out of Proverbs chapter 3, I think it is, in the Old Testament. How does it go? When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Have no fear of sudden disaster or of the ruin that overtakes the wicked. That's probably ESV, Proverbs chapter 3. Google some of those words if you want to be sure, or just find a hard copy of the Bible and read chapter 3 of Proverbs and see if you can find that passage. Okay, so stay out of crime, stay out of evil, and you will sleep better, says the Old Testament, giving some very useful practical advice for all of us. Macbeth is an extreme case of not having taken this advice. He has murdered. Now he's not going to be able to sleep well ever again. And one murder begets another. Murder the king, immediately he has to murder the servants, and more and more and more. So let's move to more or less the middle of the play. The witches had said that Banquo would be the ancestor of kings. So what does Macbeth do? He murders Banquo. He tries to murder Banquo's son as well. Banquo gets killed, the son escapes, and Banquo's son escapes to be the ancestor of later kings. People at the time of Shakespeare would know this history, largely, I think, from Holinshed. They would know that the son of Banquo did indeed survive and became the ancestor of kings. Macbeth, it turns out, is a very bad guy. He's a murderous tyrant. He kills lots of people. Scotland suffers. So Macduff. Macduff is another Scottish lord. Macduff leaves to get help from England. Macbeth murders Macduff's wife and kids. Also, Macbeth goes and finds the witches to get some more information from them. They tell him, watch out for Macduff, beware of Macduff. And they tell him, none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. No one born of a woman shall harm Macbeth. And they tell him, Macbeth cannot be defeated until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come. So Dunsinane is where Macbeth is going to make his final stand later in the play. So until Birnam Wood, until the forest itself attacks Dunsinane, Macbeth cannot be defeated. So Macbeth thinks, great, I'm charmed. I'm protected by these mystical prophecies. These witches, well, they're magic, or they've got supernatural powers of some sort. They've got inside information. I've got it too. No one can kill me who's born of woman, so I'm safe. And Macduff is my only worry, and I can't be defeated until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. Silly Macbeth. So Macduff hears of the murder of his wife and kids, and he's not real happy about it. Malcolm, the son of England, Malcolm, the son of King Duncan, and Macduff in England have some conversation. Malcolm tests Macduff to make sure Macduff is really loyal to justice and to Scotland and not just loyal to whoever's in power. And Macduff is, of course, terribly upset about his wife and kids. He's very much out for revenge, although not so much revenge as justice, I think. And they get help from the King of England, who's going to send a noble guy named Siward, Siward, to help with a lot of soldiers. So help is coming to rescue Scotland from the tyranny of Macbeth. Angered Macduff is coming. Young Malcolm, son of the last king, is coming, who everyone remembers as a good king. Good King Duncan's son is coming. Macduff is coming. An English noble is coming with a whole lot of soldiers. It's going to be okay. There's got to be some fighting first, and it's a tragedy. More people got to die, and especially Macbeth's got to die. So, summarizing the end of the play, Lady Macbeth is tormented by guilt, and she kills herself. There's a very powerful scene of Lady Macbeth being tormented by guilt. Normally, I won't say any kind of language on this channel, but I'm quoting Shakespeare here. She's like, "Out, damn spot!" She sees the blood. She's sleepwalking, right? And she remembers the blood that was on her hands when she was taking it from dead King Duncan and putting it on the servants. Initially, she's like, a little water will take care of this. Everything's going to be fine. And now she's sleepwalking and hallucinating that the blood's still on her hands. And she has this dramatic language about how nothing could clean this little hand of the blood stains on it. And I think maybe pointing to the hand, or maybe pointing to some blood that got on her clothes that she's hallucinating is on her pajamas or something. She's like, "Out, damn spot," and it won't come out. The guilt won't go away this way. Speaking of guilt and stuff, there's also another memorable scene where Macbeth says that he's handed over his own eternal jewel to the enemy of mankind, i.e. Satan owns my soul, he says. And he's insanely, but it's a kind of insanity we ordinary humans can maybe identify with if we're honest with ourselves. He will insanely sacrifice his own soul and his own happiness. He's already committed murder. He's guilty. But what does he do? Well, he doesn't repent. What does he do? He does some more murders. He's like, Satan already owns my soul. I'm doomed. I'm damned. And what am I going to do about it? I'm going to do some more murders just so that it'll be worth it. So that instead of Banquo's kids being king, my kids can be king. Eventually, Lady Macbeth and I will have some kids. Eventually, I'll have a son who can be king. I'll cheat fate. Fate made me king, but I'll cheat the prophecy of the witches somehow, destroy Banquo and his son, and make sure my kids, instead of his sons, get to be king after me. King or kings after me. All right, so Macbeth does not repent. Now, I'm moving backwards towards the middle of the play. Let's move backwards towards the beginning and make another comment on this. Thane of Cawdor. Before Macbeth was Thane of Cawdor was a different guy, a traitor, who was executed by order of King Duncan for his treachery. Malcolm reports to Duncan how the Thane of Cawdor finally went. Malcolm says nothing in his life became him like the leaving of it. In other words, when he left his life, when he was dying, when he went to death, it was the best thing he'd ever done. Apparently he was quite a sinner in life. Nothing in his life was as appropriate, as fitting as his humility and repentance at death. At death, he was penitent. At death, the Thane of Cawdor, who was a very great sinner, was repentant. He looked to God's mercy. He confessed and renounced his sins. Another line from Proverbs. I think this will be ESV. I don't remember where it is in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter something, verse something. Whoever confesses his sins and forsakes them obtains mercy. There's a contrast. You know what? I better just check it. All right. Proverbs 28, verse 13, English Standard Version. Whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. The Thane of Cawdor, as reported by Malcolm to Duncan early in the play, the Thane of Cawdor follows this advice. He repents of his sins. He dies well. And in a Christian worldview, well, who knows how long you might have to deal with the punishment of his sins and refining of his soul in purgatory before he can get to paradise, but he will have a happy eternity. Cawdor, in a Christian worldview. That's what we can expect. Not so Macbeth. Macbeth's like, Satan owns my soul, and I'm sticking with that. That's great. I'm just going to make sure it's worth something, and I'm going to do some more murders. That's Macbeth's foolish way of thinking. It's terrible. So, Lady Macbeth is tormented by guilt and dies. She apparently has committed suicide. Malcolm tests Macduff to make sure he's a good guy. Macduff hears his family was murdered. He's really ticked. He's so ready to kill Macbeth. And they march to Dunsinane to defeat Macbeth. And along the way, they pause at Birnam Wood. They cut some branches. Everyone carries a branch to hide their numbers. This, I believe, was another detail reported in Holinshed. So they carry branches from Birnam Wood. Every soldier carries a branch above him as they march, so that from a distance you can't tell how many soldiers there are, and in fact it just looks like the forest is moving. And so Macbeth hears a messenger say, I don't know whether I should believe my eyes, but, O King Macbeth, it looks like the forest of Birnam Wood is coming. And Macbeth is not pleased to hear it. That's the sign that his doom is nigh. But he still can't be killed by anyone born of woman. Well, turns out Macduff was born by cesarean section. Macbeth fears Macduff at last when that comes up. And, there's some violence. There's some killing. Seward's son dies honorably. Macbeth kills him, as I recall. There's a suggestion that the people's fighting on Macbeth's side, Macbeth's own soldiers, aren't really into it. The good side, the side coming from England to destroy Macbeth, the Malcolm Team Malcolm, Seward, Macduff, say, our enemies do strike beside us. And I'm not entirely certain that doesn't mean, well, they just change sides when we show up. They say, okay, we're with you. They turn around and join them and attack other Macbeth soldiers who haven't. But I think a footnote in a fine edition of Macbeth I read says, no, it means they strike their swords beside us. Instead of, killing us, they just, half-heartedly swing their swords and miss, and maybe they mean to miss because they don't want to fight for Macbeth. They don't care about Macbeth anymore. He's scum, and they're not going to win this. They're not really trying. Anyway, but there is nevertheless some fighting. A few people are killed, and Macduff kills Macbeth. Malcolm becomes king. Yay! Now, it's not exactly justice as such, so let's talk about that in a moment. First, what's the single biggest philosophical aspect of this play? I would say maybe it's justice, but maybe it's just the idea that life is meaningless. Now, I don't think this story is a story of life being meaningless. I think in context, that's just not how we interpret the story. It's in context of a Christian worldview. The play is not itself giving us the complete Christian worldview. It's not telling us, well, it doesn't spell out the gospel, it doesn't give us an argument that God exists. What it does is it just displays a few aspects of life and morality, specifically stuff like tyrants are really bad, and they cause a lot of harm, and they come to a bad end. And some other stuff like that stuff from Proverbs. Confess and forsake your sins, and you may obtain mercy. If you stay out of crime, you will sleep better. There's some real stuff about the moral order that's in here. You don't get to avoid guilt. You don't get to, I don't know, I guess I'm influenced again by Andrew Klavan's commentary on this play when I say this. You don't get to renounce the moral order and commit some murders or whatever else you might do in renunciation of the moral order of human life and get away scot-free. No, you lose sleep. You are tormented by guilt. You'll be like, out damn spot, and you can't get it out because it's not a blood spot on your hands. It's the guilt spot on your soul. The only sensible thing to do is do what Thane of Cawdor did at the beginning of the play. Freaking repent already. That's what you do. So, there's a lot of this. In context, I don't think this story, and even within the story, to some extent, though not everything is spelled out by any means, I think the play is not at all giving us a nihilistic picture of the universe. But that idea sure happens in this play. The idea that life is meaningless turns up in this play, and it is indeed Macbeth's view. I don't think he starts off as a nihilist, but he sure does end as one. Here I will read Macbeth. Although, honestly, you want to Google this, Google Macbeth's brief candle speech, and then click on the word videos, and you'll probably find a decent quote from some film or other where someone reads this. Patrick Stewart's Macbeth. And Patrick Stewart does this really well, and I've heard his giving of this speech. All right, so in this speech, the word candle refers to life. Brief candle refers to brief life, because life really is short. All right, so here's Macbeth. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Life is a brief candle. It's going out anyway. Out, brief candle, out now. Life is a walking shadow, a poor player, i.e. an actor that struts and frets his way about the stage, and then is heard no more, going off into oblivion. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. This, I think, is a magnificent statement of nihilism. I don't think it's Shakespeare's view by any stretch, but he gives magnificent utterance to the nihilistic perspective on life in the words of Macbeth. So that's, I think, maybe the single biggest philosophical issue in the play. So, quick overview of some philosophical perspectives on this. Is life meaningless? Well, nihilism says yes. Who actually is a nihilist? Well, Augustine says no. The meaning of life is to love God and neighbor. And we don't stop existing at death, of course. Life may be a brief candle, but that's not the end of it. And in fact, there's a bodily resurrection later. Nietzsche is not a nihilist. Nietzsche says there is no objective fact about the meaning of life, but we do get to make our own meaning. That's not nihilism, but existentialism. Sartre also is an existentialist. There's no objective fact about the meaning of life, no pre-existing fact about the meaning of life, but you do get to make your own. And Sartre gives us some rules for doing that properly. So there's the religious view. There's the... I guess there's also the Aristotelian view. The meaning of life is to fulfill the role and live up to the potential of a human being, be a properly functioning human being, achieving human potential, live by reason, and all that stuff, all the Aristotelian virtues. That's not a strictly religious perspective on the meaning of life, but it is a very important perspective in the history of philosophy on the meaning of life, and the meaning of life involves virtue, and life is not meaningless. But then, you have the Macbeth view as well. Life is totally meaningless. So there's total meaninglessness. There's existentialism, which says, well, maybe there's no objective meaning, but you get to make your own meaning. There's the Aristotelian view. Then there's the religious view. And I'm oversimplifying it somewhat. There's a lot of other things. What's another big philosophical issue in this play? Well, it's the question of justice. Now, at the end of the play, you might be thinking, oh, thank heaven, Macbeth's head got cut off. It's over. Some justice has happened. But, Macbeth murdered Banquo in front of his son. He murdered King Duncan, had the servants murdered. Oh, he murdered the servants. He murdered Macduff's wife and kids. And it's implied that there are a lot of other murders. Macbeth is a mass murderer. Can you really get justice just by having Macduff show up and cut off his head? Macbeth has caused a lot of suffering. His death is pretty brief suffering. His death is actually quite merciful, considering what he'd done. So, it's great to stop Macbeth, and assuming you're not a pacifist, you might be thinking at the end of the play, I think this is what Shakespeare wants us to think anyway at the end of the play, oh, thank God, Macduff killed him and cut off his head. The murderer got killed. Really enough justice for Duncan, Banquo, Lady Macduff, Macduff kids? How can there be justice? Will there ever be a complete justice for innocent people who are killed? Well, again, here we have a number of perspectives. Existentialism now would tell us, no, of course not. Death ends us. The world is pretty much just absurd. Now, there's still an optimistic aspect to existentialism. Sartre is very clear on this, and existentialism is a humanism, a wonderful piece of philosophy presenting existentialism. The world is pretty much just absurd, but we can do what we want with ourselves. We have freedom to determine our own response to the absurdities of the world. So, no, there's not complete justice. The world is absurd. It's not going to make sense. There won't be complete justice, but you have freedom to decide what you do with yourselves, and you can make your own response to the absurdities of this world. So there's an optimistic approach taken to the absurdity existentialism recognizes in life. Moving away from that perspective, Plato in Republic says, yeah, there's justice, but some justice is built into the soul. Macbeth, when he is a murderer, He's not actually happy because his soul's not functioning properly. There's injustice within him, and it means he's unhappy. Now, this is not, strictly speaking, in the analysis of Republic, the particular account of the soul in Plato's Republic, not exactly the same as the particular dramatic account of Macbeth being unable to sleep because of his guilt. Not just guilt feelings, but actual factual guilt. And Lady Macbeth having difficulty sleeping and sleepwalking in misery with her out-damned spot approach, realizing she can't take away her sins. Something like Plato is in Macbeth, or vice versa, but it's not exactly the same account. But at any rate, there's some justice in this life. At least the unjust are not nearly as happy as you might think on the outside. But complete justice does happen in the afterlife with the help of the gods. That's also in Plato's Republic, Book 10 of Plato's Republic. Complete justice does happen, but it'll be in the afterlife, and the gods are going to help. Augustine is somewhat similar. Both aspects of justice, both that which is the natural consequences built into the soul, built into the structure of the human being within this life, and then in the afterlife, yes, of course, there's justice. If there's any gaps left by earthly justice, God will take care of it. Don't worry about that. So the Platonic answer, the Augustinian answer, and then there's a different approach from Kant, which is also a somewhat religious answer, in that there's going to be justice. God will take care of things. There will be justice in the afterlife. It is reasonable to believe that there will be justice in the afterlife, and this belief supports a more moral life now. But you actually can't know that this is the case in this life. So those are three variations on what I think we could all classify as a religious perspective on justice, and they're one alternative to the existentialist position. And then, of course, there'll be, again, the nihilist position. Nope, no justice, that's it. So, those are some of the issues. Those are some of the events in the story. Those are some of the words, and those are some of the issues of Shakespeare's magnificent play Macbeth, and those are some of the connections to the pursuit of wisdom, which we call philosophy. Thanks for watching.